Kreco from Political Capital for organising this event with us, and a very warm welcome to Peter Pomerantsev from the LSE. Peter, delighted to see you here, and your book in Hungarian as well, which is great news. Delighted you could come here and address us on this really important issue of Russian disinformation. So what I should say at the very start is to underline the UK has got no quarrel with the Russian people. The current relationship that the UK has with Russia is not the one that we want. But, you know, a pattern of Russian aggression over the past decade is hard to ignore. The murder of Alexander Litvinenko, Russia's actions in Georgia, Crimea, Ukraine, the awful attack in Salisbury, and the campaigns of reckless and irresponsible cyber attacks. All of these undermine Russia's claim that it is a responsible international partner upholding the rules-based system. That's why the United Kingdom is at the forefront of those opposing Russia's malign activity and the abuse of the international rules-based system. For example, challenging Russian actions in Ukraine, in Syria, in the Western Balkans, in cyberspace, and in imposing sanctions. We know that Russia aggressively interferes beyond its borders. The attempted coup in Montenegro, repeated cyber attacks on other states and disruptions of others' democratic processes. We also know the Kremlin directs state-sponsored assassinations. The use of a nerve agent on British soil was yet another example of Russia's attempts to act with impunity outside international rules. Now, together with our allies, including Hungary, in response to the attack in Salisbury, we coordinated the largest ever collective expulsion of Russian intelligence officers, fundamentally degrading Russian intelligence capability for years to come. And along with our international partners and our allies, we shone a light on the reckless and irresponsible cyber activities of the Russian Military Intelligence Service, the GRU, and we must send clear messages on the consequences of Russia's malign activity. In our actions, we have seen the impact of international unity and a collective response to these threats, and will continue to show our willingness to act as a community of nations to stand up for rules around the world. As fellow permanent members of the UN Security Council, we will continue to engage on matters of international peace and security. However, we will use these channels to make clear there can be no place in any civilized international order for the kind of barbaric activity that we saw in Salisbury. Now, the Russian government has persistently used and uses disinformation as a tool to destabilize perceived enemies. This was evident, for example, in the sustained Russian disinformation campaigns which followed the attack in Salisbury, Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea, and Russia's destabilization of eastern Ukraine, among others. We know what the Russian state is doing, and it will not succeed. We're increasing our work with our international partners, academia, civil society across Europe, and today's event is a good example of that, to detect, to disrupt, to dilute, and to expose disinformation, a word about which you're going to hear a lot more this afternoon. But despite current hostilities and challenges, we continue to hold out the hope that we will one day, once again, enjoy a strong partnership with the government of that great country. So thanks again to Political Capital and to Peter, or the two Peters, for organising this event, and thank you, Peter, for being here today to talk to us on this issue. I wish you a very good afternoon of discussion about Russian disinformation. Thank you.
Dear Ambassador Lindsay, thank you very much for the nice welcoming words, and let me express our happiness and over this event could be organized, and yes, it's I think the dedication of the United Kingdom when it comes to sanctions towards Russia and when it comes to raising awareness towards the malign influence of Russia in Europe and beyond, I would say it's rather exceptional, and there is a diplomatic community that I think is receptive to this message. But at the same time, we hear more and more sounds like that. We should go back to business as usual, that the sanctions should be suspended, or we should just bring back Russia to the cooperative relationship with the European Union and member states as well. And I do think that the case of United Kingdom and for example the Salisbury attack pretty well shows that the situation is not this easy, and probably it would be a bad decision to make such gestures in a period where malign influence is rather increasing. So why do we want to invite Peter Pomerantsev, who I don't think have to explain in a very lengthy way? I will a bit. But when I read his paper back to, I think, 2015, The Menace of Unreality, he wrote it together with Michael Weiss and published at the Institute of Modern Russia, I immediately thought that such a thoughtful guy, we should invite him once to an event in Budapest. Then, a few years later, I discussed this idea with my colleagues at Political Capital. They liked the idea. Then we discussed it with the British Embassy, and they liked the idea either. And we approached then Peter Pomerantsev, who was irresponsible enough in a weak moment to say yes to this invitation. I think he didn't expect then that we will torture him for more than a day with 6 meetings and a lot of public talks. But this is going to be the last one. So, and after that, he will just go to Kiev. So Peter is a visiting senior fellow at the Institute of Global Affairs at the London School of Economics, and he's running LSE Arena, a think tank that is dealing with new ways of disinformation and how to tackle them. He is the author of 2 best-selling books. The last one is This Is Not Propaganda, which is not translated to Hungarian so far, but there is one that has been translated to Hungarian, and This Is Nothing Is True, Everything Is Possible. Libri has translated and published it in Hungarian. You can see it here at the table. And he was a journalist, and he knows the logic of the media from inside and outside as well. He worked at the UK, and he worked in Russia as well. He will work soon at the United States, and I think he's really one of the best experts of disinformation these days, not just of Russian disinformation, which is the focus point of our discussion today, but also generally the information environment that surrounds us, and also I think he has some good insights in what can be the new approach in how we tackle the information challenges that surround us. So let me again express a big thank to the British Embassy and also my colleagues who helped in the organization Katalin and from the British Embassy, Levente Nyitrai, and a lot of others who helped to make this happen. And then in the discussion, we decided with Peter it's not going to be a classical lecture, but more a discussion. First, Dorka Takács, my colleague and part of the Disinfo team, and me will raise some questions to Peter that he will respond, and then we would open up the discussion and involve the audience as well. So, Dorka, the first question is yours.
So, to start off with an easy warm-up question, was it Vladimir Putin's tech-savvy regime who invented this new mediated world where nothing is true and everything is possible, just as the title of your book says, Or, in fact, was the regime building up on already pre-existing models, like from the Soviet time? So is it only the means that differ now, or is there something more to it?
That's an incredibly deep question. That's actually that's like the philosophical question where we have to get into questions of epistemology and cognitive and cultural sort of cognitive patterns. That's a really hard question. But there does seem to have been a shift in lots of places from a kind of an Orwellian propaganda. By propaganda, I'm using the term here, mass persuasion, very, very loosely, whose aim is to convince people. Remember that great scene in 1984 when, you know, the torturer is trying to convince the victim that 2 + 2 = 5, and he has to break him, and he has to brainwash him and convince him of a different reality. And to the kind of propaganda that I saw developing in Russia in the 90s and early 2000s, but I think now we see everywhere, which is much more about seeding doubt, giving the sense, well, truth is unknowable. This very famous line from the head of Россия Сегодня, which is the biggest, or one of the 2 biggest Russian international kind of media houses, and Putin's favorite current affairs presenter, objectivity is a myth imposed upon us, which is something that we're told his journalists when they were sort of complaining about having to lie so much. And they're like, oh. So that's a switch. And obviously we can think of other examples throughout the world where we see this happening. So it's a slightly different mode. It's about seeding doubt, about uncertainty. It always existed, by the way. It was always a strategy that propagandists could use. Famously, the tobacco industry in the 60s and 70s would boast that our mission is to spread doubt about the connection between tobacco and cancer. But you know, everything always exists. You know, what's interesting is when something becomes a dominant and why it becomes a dominant. And you know, for those who've watched Russia for a long time, they've seen, you know, it's been clear how they kind of felt their way towards this sort of model through the 1990s and 2000s. So were they the first? They may have been the first who centralized it. But look, propaganda, in my interpretation, is really kind of really bad art. It's the lowest, cheapest, nastiest form of art. But just as an art, you have modernism emerge at the same time across the world. So you now have this kind of form of propaganda emerge across the world. And there's something in the zeitgeist and in certain changes in both the means of media production and the cultural sort of the cultural ground that impels towards that. But Russia was one of the first. I think they're probably the first who started screaming it internationally, and who sort of packaged it and who weaponized it. So in that sense, I think they're on the avant-garde. Was that okay? I mean, I'm trying to do a short answer because there's, you know, we can talk about this for a long time. Why is there an audience suddenly for doubt? Why do people enjoy politicians who reject facts? You know, there's a lot of interesting things going on.
So let me turn a bit to the Putin regime and what do you think? Do you think that it can change in any direction, especially in terms of its media policy? After the Grey Cardinal of the Kremlin, Vladislav Surkov, had practically disappeared, his influence has been increased in the last few years. But in your first book, you give a very detailed portrait of him, and also to a certain extent he paints himself as well as let's say the mastermind of this regime, but also it seems like you also put a bit big emphasis on his personality and his ideas and its impact on the Putin regime. So do you think that this kind of postmodern dictatorship that you explain in this book, the logic of that could change after his leave? One question. The other one is that do you think that the Ukraine policy of Russia can change after Dmitry Kozak will take over this portfolio from Vladislav Surkov? But if it's too much, then let's just respond one of the two questions.
Yeah, why don't I actually talk what I know something about? I have no idea about the future of of Russia's Ukraine policy. I'm going to Kiev tonight, and I'll be at a conference with President Zelensky, so I'll ask him. A lot of questions you asked there in one question. Let me try to sort of pass them down. So you're right. My book, the first book, which has wonderfully been translated into Hungarian, is really a kind of a biography of the Russian sort of political and media and social world in the early part of Putinism. Largely, it's focused on 2001 to 2010, and then it kind of ends with the invasion of Crimea, which I think after that you have a different Russia emerge, without a doubt. And so from what some call a hybrid regime to something which is much more recognizably authoritarian. Surkov was very interesting. So Surkov, I mean, his influence. Look, he's a metteur en scène. His job was to control the software of society. He was not a stakeholder in the system. He was not an oligarch. He didn't control any ministry of power. His job was to look after the soft stuff, the software of society. So political parties, media, culture, religion, all that stuff. Which, frankly, the big boys in the Kremlin don't take all that seriously, because they're interested in oil, war, and, like, big boy things. This is what you give to the kind of the intellectuals. Oh, go and play with political parties. But what happened under him is that he centralized the system of controlling the parties, so dictating to the parties what to do. He set up a process where all the heads of the main TV channels had to come to the Kremlin once a week, I think on Fridays, and kind of told what the themes would be for the next week, which was something that was discussed openly. This was not a secret. This was and there were constant leaks, I mean, fairly regular leaks of their instructions. But also sponsored art festivals and so on and so forth. The reason there was a postmodernist accent to it was, he himself is a little bit of a graphoman, is that a word that you guys understand? Someone who's obsessed with, absurd, I suppose. And he was obsessed with contemporary literature. He published his stories under a pseudonym in the really hip literary magazine. And they were very interesting stories, some of them quite well written, others not so much, about a cynical PR man who manipulates society, which that's what he was. So they were sort of self-satire. So he was always sort of self-consciously winking at the intelligentsia who he still wanted to be a part of, that, this is a game. It was postmodern in the sense that, there was still, officially it was still a democracy, but it wasn't really something he called managed democracy, where you always knew the outcome of all the elections. There were parties, but they were all controlled. So it was the sense of living in a simulacra, where you had all this kind of artifice of democracy, but none of it had any meaning. And a kind of cynicism that we associate with postmodernism. And his writing was postmodernist. He was very self-consciously a postmodernist writer. So in that sense, that's why I use the term. I wouldn't use it now. I think it fitted that moment. And he was interesting, the extent of his power. Look, he was told to do things and he had to execute them. He had no individual power. But he became like a brand. And as you say, he created himself as a brand. So he would let photographers accidentally wander around his office, and there'd be like a picture of Putin and a picture of Tupac Shakur, who's a big rap fan. There'd be leaked recordings of him quoting Allen Ginsberg's Kama Sutra, or was it the Sunshine Sutra by heart in English. He wrote the lyrics to these very kind of gothy rock groups, and he sponsored these very, very avant-garde, really quite shocking art festivals with kind of like nudity and things like that. And I remember one called Territoria, which he sponsored, and it said sponsored by the administration of the president, and it was like showed like granny porn and stuff like that. It was very, very avant-garde. But at the same time, he was sponsoring kind of like hardcore religious nationalists who was sort of like, whose job was to attack some of these modern art exhibitions. So it's kind of, and he put himself forward as the guy who was directing everything. And famously, he allowed his office to be photographed with a bunch of phones on his desk, each one to the leader of every political party. So kind of signalling his own influence. So he was a complete self-mystificator as well. What was interesting about him is he captured zeitgeist. There's not very many political figures who capture a certain zeitgeist and who write themselves into the zeitgeist. And he became a style. And he spawned a whole generation of spin doctors in Russia, some of whom have survived him, who try to imitate him and be like him. And I think a couple are in my book. And so a bit like Michelangelo, you know, there's the Michelangelo style, but actually it's kind of imitated by loads of people. So he became a style, and there's not, I don't know, I think that's what makes him interesting as a cultural symbol and a symbol of the times, rather than, you know, a political strategist. And, you know, there's not many people who can do that. I suppose, like, Peter Mandelson did that in England to a certain extent. I mean, Dominic Cummings is doing it now. People who just capture the moment and become associated with it. In the sense of the system continuing, I mean, he was thrown out of his position of controlling parties and media after 2012, where essentially he messed up because he tried to create a managed democracy, and then there were mass protests and people wanted real democracy, and he lost control. But because Putin only trusts a certain amount of people, he recycles people. So we keep on hearing about somebody falling, but they don't fall for very long. They get brought into another post. So he got made, exactly, again, we're not quite sure what he was doing, but a lot of stuff to do with Crimea, Abkhazia, Eastern Ukraine. And it seemed that he was kind of running Donetsk, you know, the proxy forces in Donetsk and the proxy politicians in Donetsk. Again, you know, theatre, you know, creating these kind of like independent national republics, which, you know, are not independent at all. So again, his gift is theatre, and making theatre out of politics. So in that sense, it's continued. If anything, it's spilled out from the inside of Russia to everywhere. And even though he's not connected to RT or something, the way Russian propaganda is very good at sending different messages to different groups. Again, that's something that he was doing inside the country. He'd be meeting with human rights groups in the morning and saying how much he believed in human rights, and then be meeting with nationalist conservatives in the afternoon and kind of reveling in the way that he could do different discourses. And, you know, Russian propaganda today, I mean, we've done a lot of studies at the LSE, it's Germany, and it'll be talking to the far right with one hand, the far left with another, and business elites with another, and managing all those discourses. And I'd say that's all part of the Sokovian style. But where he is at the moment, I think you know, he's sanctioned. When he was sanctioned, so he can't travel very much. So I don't know exactly what he's doing. But when he was sanctioned, he said, you know, the only two things about the West I care about are Tupac Shakur and Allen Ginsberg, and I can have them in Russia. So yeah, yeah.
So staying here at the fact that the Kremlin is staging like all these political movements, in your book you write about how it also staged that the Kremlin kind of crawls into these pro-democracy movements as well, and impacts many groups. And then after crawling into these pro-democracy movement, it magically uncovers itself, and then it can pinpoint that, look, it's in fact third parties, third forces that are kind of influencing our country. Do you think that after, for example, having the summer protest in Moscow, do you think that these revealings are still as strong as they were? Or do you think that after a point, the Russian society simply loses its interest in it and will be kind of cynical towards that?
So just to make sure that I understood, so you mean when the Kremlin plants itself in genuine opposition movements or in opposition movements that it's created?
Let's say both.
Okay. Look, this is a very old Russian tradition. My favorite 19th century Russian novel, even though it's kind of early 20th century, whatever, big fat Russian novel is Andrei Biely's St. Petersburg, which is all about this world in late Tsarist times where, you know, you don't know who's working for who, where it's these Tsar's secret police crawling inside an anarchist movement, where it's the anarchist movement crawling inside the far left movement, you know, where the Freemasons are. It's this endless kind of, endless sort of intrigue and interpenetration and mask upon mask upon mask. And obviously, you know, Dostoevsky's The Devils is an even more famous book about this. So in a way, it's a very old Russian game to play. Yeah, so I think that tradition will go on. I think it's particularly relevant today because, you know, even when the Kremlin might be found out doing something like this, it helps to strengthen the feeling that it's everywhere. Yeah. So we talk about, you know, sometimes the Kremlin's operations abroad can look very cack-handed. So we mentioned the coup attempt in Montenegro. It wasn't very hard to find that the Russian secret services were behind it. But that may well have been the point, just to say, we're here, we don't care. You know, you might be in NATO, but we're still going to hurt you. So again, being revealed might be half the point. So yes, I think that's an old tradition and it will continue. And look, the Kremlin's aim, again, coming back to my first point, isn't so much to convince, but to just give the sense of uncertainty that you can't trust anything. I mean, there was a very interesting rumor that went around Moscow, and I don't know who started it, so I can't prove it. But like during the 2012 protests, which were big protests against Putin. And obviously the official propaganda was, this is Hillary Clinton's sponsorship of a color revolution in Russia. They're all CIA, they're all agents of Yale University, they're obsessed with Yale University, and Hillary Clinton, and she's drugged them, and that's why all these people have come out on the streets. That's what the TV channel said. That's the official boring one. That's a boring one for Russians. I think the Russians yawn when they hear that. Then a rumor started going around, and I don't know if it came from the Kremlin, but I think it should have done, that actually Navalny and the protest leaders were actually working for the Kremlin and were Kremlin agents, and the whole thing is a provocation to test loyalty. And that's much more subtle, because that just makes you give up. You know, if you're working for the CIA, like, yeah, Hillary's going to come, Yale is going to come. But if everything is actually a Kremlin operation, then it makes you just give up entirely. Conspiracy thinking, which has replaced ideology as the kind of the main government idiom in Russia, but we see it repeated in other countries, has a very subtle effect. If you have the sense that you live in a world of unfathomable conspiracies, where the truth is never known, where everything is a hidden hand behind another hidden hand, then it gives you the sense as a citizen that you can't change anything. Yeah? It de-incentivizes you. It's a very good way of giving you the sense that it's not worth fighting for democracy. And it works. It works. Definitely that's used very, very aggressively by the Kremlin. I've seen it used in a lot of countries, actually, that the ambassador mentioned. It's quite a common strategy now. You know, the favorite catchphrase of Dmitry Kisilov, the guy who said that objectivity is a myth imposed upon us, is a coincidence. I don't think so. And he does these almost sort of ballet-like performances in his TV show where he goes, it's really quite remarkable. It's a form of intellectual gymnastics where he kind of flies between these incredible conspiracy theories, often very intellectual, involving interesting bits of history and kind of like you're sitting there, oh wow, interesting. And kind of like just weaves this world by the end of which you're like, I have no idea how the world is run. I'm just going to sit here and drink beer. So it's a propaganda that is meant to make you passive, which again is a big switch because propaganda in the modern sense is born of Napoleon's need to create an army. That's really where modern propaganda theory begins. It's all about activizing people, getting people to sacrifice themselves for a higher cause. It's all about creating action. This is the opposite. This is propaganda to make you passive, which again is I think a slightly new form.
Dmitry Kisilov can be familiar to Hungarian audience as well because he was the guy who came up a few years ago with the idea that it was well known beforehand as well. He just repeated that 1956 revolution in Hungary against the Soviets was practically one of the first color revolutions staged by the CIA, and it was by far-right movements and so on. And it caused a bit of diplomatic turbulence as well, just a bit of, but something. So it's he targets sometimes even Hungary with this kind of conspiracy theories. One question about the Russian propaganda for international use. So you did quite a lot of research in European countries. What do you think the biggest success of Russian propaganda in general and disinformation? And which are the countries where you could find that it can be the most successful? So it's not about naming and shaming specific countries, it's much more about what's the common features of the countries where the active measures and this kind of disinformation operations can be the most effective.
I think there's two parts of that question for you which are very important. One is, what is an effective information operation, full stop? So downstairs from me at the LSE, I'm on the 9th floor. On the 7th floor is the wonderful Media and Communications Department. And there is several professors there whose job is to study what is known as media effects, which is the social science of trying to work out how does media affect audiences. It's been around, it's been around for a while, but it's been around certainly since sort of the 50s and 60s and 70s. And since that time, Media Effects has been trying to answer one question, which is really the main question that I wanted to answer right at the start. Do violent movies make people violent? After 70 years of researching this, they have decided that sometimes, maybe, in certain conditions, for a certain period of time. So Media Effects, I actually really value it because it at least gives us something to work with in the weird cultural, ephemeral world of information. At least it gives us some sort of science to try to make sense of it. But talking about the effectiveness of something, I don't know. I mean, in my new book, I interview a guy who was the father of the company that became Cambridge Analytica, something called SCL, and his whole shtick was that advertising is bullshit. Like, nothing in advertising works. They have no science behind it. There's a lovely phrase that advertisers told me. We know that half of advertising is rubbish. We just don't know which half. So the whole thing is so inexact. There are things you can pinpoint. You can see changes in language. Framing. Is Ukraine being described as fascist more often? I mean, there are things that we can measure. Things like that I think you can measure. But attitudinal change, behavioral change, political impact, it's really tough. Having said that, what do we know? Not stepping back from Russia. Low trust societies, very, very vulnerable. There's a lovely study by Northeastern University about people who don't believe mainstream media are more likely to believe in really crazy things. So it's a funny thing, because you think skepticism would make you more evidence-based, but no, actually there's a point where skepticism tips over into, flat earthism. Low trust societies. So Walter Quadraciocchi at the University of Venice talks about polarization in society makes people very ripe for disinformation. Again, there's a little bit of social science behind it. Daniel Kahan at Yale, the Cultural Cognition Project, has talked about how the stronger you cleave to your cultural identities, the less likely you are to believe, to be open to evidence-based arguments. Yeah? It's got nothing to do with education. It's got to do with how strongly you cling to your emotional and political identities. So that kind of polarization, low trust. So I guess those would be the things to look for. Those would just be, that's not a Russian thing. I think that would make you susceptible. But let's name and shame, because that's more fun. Look, my sense is, having looked at it in several countries, everybody's using each other. It's this utter snake pit of cynics in Italy, in France, in Russia. Russia knows these guys want money and media support out of them. These guys know they need to play Russia, but not really piss off Brussels or the EU too much. It's this game where everybody's using each other and everyone's super cynical. And we did a lot of work looking at Italy and then bits of the far right in Germany. Maybe there's a few ideological actors out there who really think that, Russia, a country which was, I think, 20% Muslim, and when no one goes to church, is the last bastion of white Christendom. Maybe somebody believes this. I mean, there's a certain Buchananite bit of America which believes this. But generally, I think we're talking about really cynical trade-offs between power brokers. But that's not really what I deal with, because that's like, the sort of stuff that you think about probably, or you guys think about. I'm more interested in systemic bits. And it's when you have alienated audiences, low trust audiences, and that kind of polarization where fact-driven discourse can't fit in. Look, the best lies and the best disinformation campaigns are the ones that fit what people wanted to hear in the first place. I really recommend an absolutely glorious essay by Colin Burrow, which has just been published in the latest London Review of Books, where he talks about Iago in Shakespeare. And he sort of analyzes how Iago manipulates Othello. And it's all about Iago fitting his lies to Othello's paranoias and his sense of, being a Moor in a Venetian society. And then he makes this wonderful parallels of the way algorithms work, how algorithms fit themselves around your fears and your prejudices. And disinformation today can fit itself around you and your personal Othello-like weaknesses. So Surkov and Iago is our age. So anything that augments those vulnerabilities. So maybe countries with very weak public broadcasters, because public broadcasting is always one of the ways that you're meant to counterbalance this.
Almost always, yeah. One question connected to that. What can you mention some research or anecdotal stories about what can work in reducing polarization in societies? Because, and especially, it's quite challenging in times when a lot of politicians are domestically, not because of foreign influence, are very interested in fueling polarization, because this is the way how they feel they can win better elections. So what can journalists do if they want to create some kind of common ground? What can NGOs, think tanks do? So what could be the strategies of reducing this kind of polarization, at least on the micro level?
Well, it's funny you should mention that, because I've created a whole think tank that just looks at this. Thanks for teeing me up. Look, polarization has many roots, and some of them have got nothing to do with media and information. So they might be economic, they might be racial. I don't know. There could be many reasons. So I look at a very, very small bit of this very large puzzle. I don't really like the word polarization because it means different things to different people. There's nothing wrong with polarized political debate. That's good. That's healthy. I think what we're talking about when we talk about polarization is that moment where the trust is so low, the dehumanization of the other side is so high that you stop being able to have a debate. That moment when you just have separate reality bubbles, which I think America is a very stunning example of that. Just looking at all the data about media trust, people trust their own media and don't trust the other media. So complete politicization of trust. I don't know if you can think of other countries like that. But so what do we do in terms of creating media that starts to smooth that and bring people together? And that's what we do. We launch different experiments, and we worked in Italy, but we're doing a lot of work in Ukraine, where this is obviously a critical issue because it became part of the war. I mean, in one sentence, and without getting too nerdy about it, you have to constantly think about the effect that your media is having. So not just telling the truth, or not just doing those things that journalists do and should continue doing, but then thinking, okay, how are we going to get this to these different audiences? What is it that these different audiences, what kind of biases do they have? What are their cognitive patterns? Why do they have low trust? How can we try to inspire trust? And there's very different ways to do that. From, trying to involve them in a conversation, because when people get involved in a conversation, they get more, the level of trust rises. Something that they're trying at the University of Texas, Talia Stroud, sort of a distant colleague of mine, is getting Republicans and Democrats to talk online in America, but just taking away the labels. And the minute you take away the labels, Republican and Democrat, people tend to get on much better. I think a lot of work has to be done with sort of cultural trauma. So in Ukraine, there's a lot of traumatic periods in the country's history, actually in the country's recent history, 1970s, 1990s, which aren't discussed, which haven't been worked through, but which have traumatized everybody, both in the east of the country and the west of the country. And if you start, for example, we made films about Chernobyl, about the war in Afghanistan. The series Chernobyl was this runaway hit in Ukraine. on both sides. Whether you're a Russian speaker, Ukrainian speaker, everyone loved it because finally people were talking about an incredibly traumatic period that hadn't been discussed and where everybody was a victim. It was like, it doesn't matter which one you were. So we started looking at that. What are the common traumas? Actually, these societies are actually united by their traumas. And my instinct is, even though I can't prove it, can't prove anything in media effects, so I might as well just say it, is that the propagandists, and now I'm talking about very cynical political spin doctors and manipulators, are aware of these traumas instinctively. They don't have to study them, and use that confusion and uncertainty to give these very aggressive identities to people at a time of trauma and confusion, the way a cult would do. In this book, I have a lot about cults, but it's sort of similar. So certainly Putin does that, constantly repeating the traumas of the 1990s. We were on our knees and I've raised you up, constantly like pressing that and saying, I am the solution to that trauma. And them over there are the kind of the guilty ones. So I think getting into that is very important. Obviously you can't do that when you do news. I'm talking here about larger cultural projects and documentaries and stuff like that. But in terms of news and debating, we can be much more concrete. I mean, back in the 1990s, a very important academic in this field called Kathleen Hall Jameson came up with the term the right-wing echo chamber in America. And she talked about how the way American debating shows were structured and the way media covered politics was personality-driven, almost like a reality show, and incentivized that sort of behavior. And she gives lots and lots of examples. You know, there are actually moments where Gingrich and Clinton were prepared to get on, and the media wanted more conflict, because that gives you ratings. And she said this personality-driven way of covering politics means that voters grow very, very cynical. They might watch it because it's fun, but they grow very cynical, and no one's discussing the real issues. So my sense is, can we approach it in another way? Can we do debating shows which aren't just about, I don't know, Elizabeth Warren attacking Michael Bloomberg? Because the way debating shows in America at the moment, for example, I think the same everywhere, is structured is that, you know, if you attack someone, they've got 30 seconds to respond. If they attack you back, you've got 30 seconds to respond. The whole thing is designed to impel people slagging each other off like in a reality show. Surprise, surprise, a reality show president won. Could we structure them completely differently? Could we, for example, could we give them a policy solution, a policy problem, and then ask them how they will collaborate with each other and with the other side to achieve it? Immediately you have a completely different type of incentive to collaborate. You have to be very evidence-based. You have to show how you're going to achieve that. There's a whole movement called constructive news, which is not a very well thought through movement yet, but trying to think about media which doesn't just cover events, but is always looking for ways to resolve them. And there's different ways of doing that. I mean, from having positive characters who are trying to do something through to having, you know, actual policy wonks give solutions. But it's more an editorial mindset. Yeah? Instead of just painting the world black and garish, you change the structure. And the idea is that sort of, by creating the sort of push towards solutions, you get a much more factually driven, much more evidence-based, and much more collaborative conversation. Look, none of these solutions are silver bullet solutions. All of, you know, media is an art. It's not actually a science. But what's most important is to have that attitude and to have that mindset and to have those incentives. So we did a project with Corriere della Sera in Italy, who are the newspaper of record. And you know, we looked at how you can write about migration in ways that didn't engender polarization. It's a very polarized theme in Italy, like it is here. But ways that encourage trust and a factually driven conversation and all that kind of good stuff. And we found ways to do that. We found there were ways to write about the topic that would help that. But they're not the ones that get like and shares. So the economy of the internet is actually rigged towards polarization, because the more extreme position you take, the more likes and shares you get. So there's a real tension there in the structure and the economic incentives of the way social media has been designed. And that leads to very big questions. You know, do we then need some massive EU-wide public support for media that don't have to follow those incentives. So it gets into very structural issues. Yeah.
Staying with the topic of media, in your book you mentioned that the new Kremlin is not going to commit the same mistake of making the TV dumb as the Soviet Union did. Therefore, it kind of merges Western entertainment and autocracy. And do you think basically now that the TV consumption is declining, especially among youth, that the youth can kind of get out of this grip?
Yeah, I mean, the Kremlin and the BBC are very similar. They both face this crisis after a complete hegemony, complete control. They're like, oh my God, there's this young generation that doesn't switch on the box. They're trying to keep up. I mean, that's why they've created all these kind of... Look, they responded to the internet in 3 ways, basically. And not all of them are completely successful. So the 2012 protests were all about... They were like the internet emerged onto the street. And before that, the Kremlin had let the internet kind of be its own thing. And so they responded in 3 ways. One of them is laws. So lots of laws about extremism online. Extremism being whatever the Kremlin wants extremism to be. And used completely arbitrarily. With kind of show trials. Like, you liked an article saying Ukraine should be spelt with a U. In jail, whatever. I'm joking, but it's that kind of stuff. Just very vague laws and then arbitrary show trials, just to make everyone really scared about what they say online. Secondly, it was kind of like another big sort of technological thing was kind of, if you think that sort of like what the NSA do is a bit invasive, Russia is a system where everything is stored by the secret services on social media. So anything you write is stored, and you know that it's stored, and it's that, it's that panopticon feeling. They know everything. Then they take over all the sort of big social media companies, get taken away from the people who invented them and given to Kremlin loyalists. So that's kind of the technology of the internet is taken over. They make sure now that search algorithms will have lots of Kremlin news at the top. That when you open the sort of search bars, lots of Kremlin news hits you first. So they kind of worked out that, okay, you've got to work with the algorithms and put pressure on the companies that are actually very good companies, but that provide the algorithms. So there's that technological and legal side. Then there's the content side. So it's the creation of the troll farms, which were initially created to counter domestic opposition. It's the creation of this plethora of like dodgy websites. And, how effective is that? It's part of a much bigger apparatus, but it's there. So they invested into content as well. So they're trying to work that space. Maybe they find it harder. There's still pockets of dissent online. There's a flourishing YouTuber scene in Russia, with these really rather brilliant, young guys who get paid just through Patreon or whatever, and do quite daring films and quite daring things. So that kind of lives, but they seem quite comfortable with that. I think they've always allowed a certain amount of dissent. They've always been like sort of like watching that it doesn't slip into anything too big. So it's the youth. There's always so much. There's always so much hope put into the youth politically, isn't there? And we're all aware they are always hopeless when it comes down to it.
You started to discuss about what could be somehow the ways of or regulating social media companies, but this is a very hot debate right now in the whole Western world. With some say that Europe is kind of champion in that respect with GDPR and some other plans for regulators. I not totally agree, but there are quite a lot of measures that are going to be taken in the next few years in the European Commission, for example. That also these are issues in the UK, in the US as well. So what would be your recommendation to policymakers, decision makers, assuming that they can have some impact on the social media companies, which is an if, but still, that what should they do? So what is the good way of regulation that does not kill these platforms that in some regions of the world, including Central Eastern Europe, still enjoy rather high respect and trust, but at the same time, let's say, enabling more fact-based discussions and discussions that are not closing people in echo chambers.
Well, I'd actually like to return to something that the ambassador mentioned several times, because I think it needs a little bit of nuancing. So he mentioned the term disinformation several times. So when we, and we're not the only ones, quite a lot of other researchers think about disinformation, we kind of put it into three forms of disinformation. And one of them is content, which is what the ambassador was talking about. So disinforming content. So stories about the Skripals were actually murdered by I don't know, Michael Jackson, that sort of thing. Yeah. That's actually the least important one. And that's actually the one that's legally the hardest to define. Disinformation is not a legal category. There's nothing in the international human rights law about disinformation. Also, a lot of these campaigns aren't true or false. If you think about the most famous Russian social media covert campaign, it was in America in 2016. A lot of the information, the content, was neither true nor false. It was like, Bernie is great, or Trump is sexy, or Hillary's ugly. I mean, like, whatever. These are not true or false statements. Much more important is to think about disinformation in terms of behavior. So you have mass covert campaigns that are amplifying this content in inorganic ways. The problem with the US campaign, was not the content so much, but the fact that you had American voters thinking that these were regular people in Wyoming or Minnesota putting out these opinions, when actually it was a mass campaign coordinated from St. Petersburg. So it was a mass deceptive campaign. The behavior was deceptive, not the content. Now that's much more important, and that's something we should regulate. I'm not talking about individual anonymity. That's fine. A person can be anonymous for whatever reason. You just say, I'm anonymous because security, satire. It's here as like an active mass deception that's going on, and it's a campaign. And the power of the internet is not a single piece of content. It's the scalability and the amplification and the targeting. So that, I think, can be regulated, and I very much hope that will be regulated. I think troll farms should be illegal. Yeah? You can do an open campaign, but that kind of deceptive campaign, that needs to change. And then we think of deception in terms of the actor. The actor is deceptive. So we have these consistent deceptive actors like the GRU who launch these campaigns. And I think we could take action against them, so sanction them, etc., etc. So I think you can take action against the behavior and the actor, and you could, that should be in law. And I think that's part of freedom of expression, because I think the citizen has a right to know who's trying to influence them and how. So I think that's actually in keeping with the spirit of freedom of expression, which is also the freedom to receive information. And this gets into concepts around fraud, and, this gets us into quite solid legal concepts. I am not a lawyer, I have to say, but it seems to me they're pretty solid. Also, I asked a couple of lawyers. The content stuff is almost impossible to regulate unless we start becoming like the Russians and start doing extremist laws and take that off. It's a very bad logic. It also fundamentally misunderstands the internet. It doesn't matter that one person is saying Ukrainians are fascists. The problem is the mass campaign that is saying that. It's the campaign you need to disable, not the one idiot who's saying Ukrainians are fascists. So that's I think the direction that the regulation has to go, and it has to be a regulation that's all around making the internet more transparent, more accountable, and empowering citizens. Hopefully we'll go that way. The initial laws that have been taken to regulate the internet are not very effective, and B, probably in themselves illegal, because they will collide with international human rights law. So various attempts in Germany to sort of, make individual pieces of content illegal and try to chase them down. It's both impossible and a waste of time, and unclear whether it's actually whether you can apply the principles that were applied to broadcasting to something an individual says online. We have one set of laws for TV stations. In Britain, TV stations have news which has to be impartial, accurate, etc., and they will be fined by our regulator if they don't do that. That's very different to saying that my grandmother has to say things which are balanced, impartial, and accurate. I mean, they're both dead, so it'd be quite hard for her. But you know what I mean. We all have, you know, you can't regulate people's speech on social media the way we regulate a broadcaster. That's what we've been trying to do so far.
So, well, in your book, this is not propaganda.
Okay.
There is a key figure who occurs quite many times, who is Sergej Popovich.
Oh yeah, Sergej, yeah.
Yeah, and the thing is that he was basically like one of the main organizers of the Odpor movement in Serbia, which really strongly contributed to the fall of Milosevic's regime. And the thing is that his manuals and his techniques apparently have come to the wrong hands.
Yeah.
Is this only what happened? For example, being now also Nashi, the Russian radical extreme groups using them. So is it only it that it just got into the wrong hands, or did there something else also go wrong?
And one question connected to that, I mean, to turn it upside down, I mean, do you see some kind of best examples on how to counter this kind of cynical campaigns, postmodern campaigns that are increasingly part of the toolkit of the authoritarian regimes? So do you, I mean, it can be got in the wrong hand, but still, what are the techniques that can work? So what would you recommend to, let's say, Russian opposition groups or human rights groups, or what can they do in an environment where it's increasingly difficult to push through your message and even it's lost in the information noise?
Yeah, I don't have an immediate full answer to that, but it's very important to identify the lack. So we, as in the people who thought they represented deliberative democracy in its future, there's kind of a theory there that with a mix of media and, you know, some political parties and some parliaments, we could have a healthy deliberative democracy. And some NGOs, throw some civil society in there, and a bit of academia, and that was the mix. And you know, groups who don't like deliberative democracy very much, want to see other political models, have worked out you can play between the lines, and that you can create these kind of campaigns which are very hybrid and achieve a certain amount of political effect. So the question is, you know, do our civil society groups have to start thinking in completely new ways? Or is there a new generation of civil society group whose job it is to smooth polarization, to reach alienated audiences, to constantly, in a way, I'm just going to take extremist groups as one example, the way extremist groups would try to find vulnerable parts of the population to pull them towards their extreme far-right or extreme Islamist ideology? Do we also need a whole world of civil society groups who are competing in that field? Because at the end of the day, look, you can regulate, and that's fine, but at the end of the day, when it comes to political speech, there's only so much regulation you can or want to have. You're going to have to compete. And if the way we've created media, who are meant to be doing some of this work, can't keep up with the new world, then I think you're going to have to see some sort of new actor emerge, whose job it is. Because I'm very confused whose job it is. Kind of public broadcasting a little bit, but it's so unwieldy, it's so slow, and it's so stuck in broadcasting, and I can see you be reluctant to do a lot of this stuff. So I think and it can't be media, because media is doing the opposite. Media is part of the problem. Media is usually making the polarization worse because they have to feed their audience and live off likes and shares, and you know they have to live off that world. So I think some new kind of actor has to evolve. I don't know if this is actually the new iteration of civil society in the information age. The closest example we have are probably counter-extremism groups, but they were working on the fringes. Well, now the problem is in the centre. You know, they're working with vulnerable, you know, youth in northern England who are getting sucked into ISIS ideology. So that's a very niche job. Here we're talking about the whole of society needs bringing into one environment. So maybe it's a new iteration of civil society. Certainly the way, you know, we've got human rights groups are over here, and you know, minority rights groups are over here, and green people are over here, but who's connecting up the dots? You know, it was meant to just happen. It was meant to be just sprout. So I think that's something new will start to emerge. Certainly I see kind of a lot more thinking around what does democracy mean in a digital age? What does it actually mean? What does it mean to have human rights online? How does one secure those rights? So that's that bit, and I think we're just at the start of that journey. At least the right questions are starting to be asked. Your questions are always so intriguing. I'm not quite sure how to answer them. So basically, the story that you're talking about. So Srđan Popović was a Serbian revolutionary who, after helping organize the overthrow of Milosevic, sort of trained activists across the world in non-violent resistance movements, non-violent demonstrations. And he's got a whole school of thought about kind of bringing different, actually, he would be quite inspirational for some of this, like bringing very, very different civic groups together, how they set an aim and stuff like that. You know, so he's the bête noire of the Iranian regime and the Russian regime, and you know, he's worked with activists across the world. Again, I wouldn't overstate his influence. He just trains people who are already doing something to be more effective and to ensure that what they do stays non-violent. Because his whole theory of change is that non-violent protests are more effective than violent ones. So that, yeah, the only problem is that, you know, there's absolutely nothing stopping extreme Islamists or Nazis using the same principles. So in the book, I interview this leader of a far-right, literally extremist movement. I mean, by any official definition, extremist movement in Austria. And he's like, when he found out that I had a chapter about Srđan Popović, he was so excited. He was like, Srđan is one of my heroes. That's what we've been doing. You know, we've been taking all the far-right groups across Europe and bringing them together, finding what we have in common, setting aims, doing cultural change. It's so exciting. And I was like, oh my God. So yeah, I did ask Srđan about this, and he said, yes. He had an elaborate excuse, not excuse, he had an elaborate theory that because his theory of change was always about bringing different groups together, there was a natural bend towards moderation. So in theory, when you bring all these different groups together, you should become more moderate. So I guess these guys have gone from being extreme neo-Nazis to just being like, you know, fascists. So they had actually become less extreme. So maybe he's right. Maybe if it wasn't for Srđan, they'd be, you know, kristallnachting. And as it is, they're just stopping refugee boats in the middle of, you know, the Mediterranean and turning them back.
Okay, I would like to open up the floor for questions. So please introduce yourself and please, raise real questions. That would be my request. First, Tibor.
Thank you. Fascinating discussion and a real great book. And you describe in the book that how traditional propaganda is working in Russia, in this book. But you do something much more than that. You also describe something how the soft material is working. One of the most touching stories is about the suicide of the fashion model. It is in this book, right? And my question, short question is that how on earth a political power is able to manipulate in such a wide scope the sentiment of the people? I mean, in the story, for those who didn't read it, that you were working on the story of a suicide, and then you suddenly got an order that you should portray spin it somehow more positive or something, if I remember correctly. So it shouldn't be such a tragedy, because tragedy was all right for this month, the next month, tragedy is not right, we are now a happier Russia. But my question is that what kind of political machine is able to handle, because building agent into oppositional parties, that's easy. Having a troll farm in Leningrad, that's also easy. But to manipulate sentiments all over Russia in such a diverse subject as a suicide, as a football match, and as a whatever, religious sects, what you also mentioned in the book, how this operation in such a level of complexity works outside of the traditional, well-defined pillars of propaganda, which is fascinating, But the real question is how this atmosphere is created.
It's a really good question.
That was a question.
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's a very good question.
Okay, let's go for that first.
Well, yeah, I mean, so look, so it is a centralized system, you know, and it's a different type of centralized system. So Gleb Pavlovsky, who's a character in my second book, who's a Russian, another very interesting character like Surkov, because he's both a spin doctor who works with the Kremlin, but also an intellectual who analyzes itself and himself. So again, these very self-reflective characters. He describes the Kremlin system as a jazz orchestra. Yeah? So Putin gives the tune, A Night in Tunisia, and then everyone has to improvise around it. And people at all levels understand the tune, but you know, you can have a John Coltrane like Surkov play his own melody, and this guy play his own melody. In terms of the enemies, the other, that's constantly being redefined, but there's always another. It's always this kind of, you know, from the 90s, it's been a populist discursive strategy, yeah? Not an elite, they're elites, yeah? So it's not a populist governing strategy, but a populist discursive strategy. It's always the Putin majority instead of the people. Большинство. There's a большинство, and there's people outside the большинство. All the propaganda actually has one message to it. There is no alternative to Putin. And if you know that, if you know that's the big story, then you can improvise ways. Another very good metaphor is, actually, this is very interesting because Russia, I don't know how much of you follow the theatre of Grotowski in Poland, but this idea of improvisational theatre, where there's a director or lead actor who sets the idea and the tone, and all the actors have to improvise around it. That was very big in Russia in the 70s and 80s with Vasilyev, Theatre Vasilyev, which is an underground theatre. And then his students were the ones who created the TV channel I worked for. Yeah? Avant-garde guys, very, very, very avant-garde. They weren't actually interested in politics. They were interested in, you know, can they make homosexuality okay in Russia? Because a lot of them were gay. And I mean, they were fascinated by how do they change the discourse of society in entertainment. I mean, I was working there in a much sunnier time, sort of 2006, 2007. But their thing was completely clear. So the channel I worked for, the job of the channel I worked for was to create a bright, happy, optimistic Russia. Not even because of ideology, partly because of marketing. You know, that was what their marketing was. There were other channels which did something else. And I have to say, sort of in that story, yeah, I was told over and over by the producers, you've got to find a happy ending. I'm like, I have a double suicide on my hands. They're like, where's the happy ending? And it became ridiculous. They did tell me at the start. I mean, it was me that got sort of obsessed with the story. There are Russian channels which do the opposite. Yeah. So NTV, which was actually a much more propagandistic channel, which does news, always did how horrible Russia is. Russia full of terrorists and rapists and maybe suicide by weird sects. And therefore, you need Putin's strong hand to protect you. They're very into their media effects theory. You know, they do a lot of thinking. They're very, you know, they're old school Russian propagandists, the people who run the channels. You know, they're fascinated by social research. They're fascinated by sociology. They're fascinated by the idea of the propagandist as a demigod who, you know, in communist times would be engineering human souls. Now you're engineering mini Putins. And they think about these big things. So they were very aware of things like mean world theory, which is an old theory of media effects, that the more people watch the news, the more horrible they think the world is, and therefore the more fearful they become. Yeah? So therefore, you know, they're like, okay, instead of doing positive stuff about Russia on this other channel, let's do negative. And that'll actually make people more dependent on the Kremlin. But the one I was in was the opposite. It was about youth. It was about brightness. The colors were all pink and yellow. And it was about a young country, very aspirational, making money for the first time. And suicides just did not fit. That wasn't, you know, I had to say they did tell me at the start, that was just as much me, you know, getting obsessed with the story. But coming back to this idea of improvisational theatre, everyone even the guys that I was working for, who were very liberal, most of them have left Russia actually, they're all in LA now. Very, very liberal, but they also understood completely what was their role in this huge improvised media orchestra, and they would never leave that role. That's our role. We do the happiness. This is what we do. Don't leave the happiness. Yes, that makes the system very supple and very able to transform. It can turn, because it's improvisational, it can keep on reinventing itself. And we've had 3 Putinisms so far already, He's like Sir Alex Ferguson with Manchester United. He's created 3 Russias already, Sorry, not everybody does football metaphors. I know some people in Hungary like football, but they're not in the room today. So there's already been 3 Putinisms. There have been 3 versions of the Bolshevik, 3 different types of enemy. It's always changing. That's the first bit I wanted to say. The second bit is, at the end of the day, media, propaganda, all this stuff, without the hard fist of the repressive mechanisms, it wouldn't work. Yeah? Just what Putin has understood, and this is not my line, this is some Russian professor, Yakovenko, I think, who's a media professor, says Stalin was 75% violence and 25% propaganda. Putin is 75% propaganda and 25% violence. He doesn't need to do mass repressions. He works out, he puts 1 oligarch in prison, and everywhere, the face of Khodorkovsky behind bars, put everywhere. If I can do this to the most powerful person, I can definitely do this to you. Pussy Riot. You think you're an stray? We will arrest young women and put them in jail. That's how callous we are. So non-stop signaling of the repressive mechanisms, non-stop letting you know that, fun and games, postmodernism, oh no, very old school as well. So I don't think any of it would work without just good old gulag sort of there. It's just less of it compared to the image.
So Ryan Aiken from the American Embassy, and my colleague Ben and I both from the embassy as well. It's a bit of a personal topic for the 2 of us, as we're both expelled and declared persona non grata from the Russian Federation in the wake of the Skripal attack. But I bring that up for this context. When the foreign ministry invited the diplomatic community to the foreign ministry to provide Russia's explanation for what happened in Salisbury. And in a meeting we had prior to that, we gathered some of, mainly EU member states, NATO member states, and sat down and hashed out, we knew what the 3 Ds were going to be from Yermakov, who presented the Russian response to Salisbury. It was going to be first deny that Russia had any involvement in it whatsoever. It was going to be to dismiss any allegations made against the Russian Federation for its involvement in Salisbury, and then it was going to be to disinform or misinform with respect to what had happened. And so I ask you this, you've touched on it, in several ways, but I ask you this, in terms of those of us who are practitioners, and state practitioners, and this is what we are trying to figure out. How do we respond to Russian 3Ds, denial, dismissal, disinformation, and far too often, and you'll excuse this particular analogy, but I feel like we're the Admiral Kuznetsov. So we are seen sailing from Arkhangelsk all the way around the North Sea and through the Med with this belching black smoke, and then we arrive, on station to begin our counterattack. The catapults fail and our efforts, fall into the sea.
You talk about the GEC here.
We lose $31 million in fighter aircraft because we have been so poor at this. But from a practical, state level perspective, I'd just be interested to hear, your thoughts. I know you've touched on this briefly, but that's where I'll leave that.
There's nothing I can say which isn't a banality. I mean, forget about them. Think about the audience. Just think about it's the. All successful examples I've seen when someone debates someone like that publicly. The other side isn't trying to win an argument. They're just trying to get between you and your audience. You just forget about them and go through you have to know the audience better and see what works for them. Just almost ignore them. You're on a race to understand audiences better. But I'm not telling you anything that MSC Saatchi won't tell you. It's just but it's true. And Schopenhauer writes about this. That is the worst thing to do, is to get bogged down trying to debate with people who are not trying to debate you. So the main thing is just knowing your audiences better, and then how we do that, and what we haven't done as public diplomacy, if we're going to get into the weeds, is embrace the digital age when it comes to Russia. The ambassador said right at the start, our quarrel isn't with the Russian people. In the Cold War, we were very good at this. We were very good at having one channel of communication with the Kremlin and completely other ones to reach out to the Russian people. I remember this amazing moment when Margaret Thatcher went on Russian TV, which every Russian person of that generation remembers. She went on Russian TV and made mincemeat out of the Soviet Kishilovs of that time. I think Reagan then went on as well, didn't he? Wow. Directly to the Russian people. Obviously, that's a different situation. And I know we've had some difficulties with American ambassadors trying to tweet at Russian citizens. However, have we really embraced the potential of digital to talk to the Russian people? I don't think we have. In the Cold War, it was genuinely hard to reach them with censorship. Now, you just put up a YouTube channel. We've got a whole paper about this that we wrote, which is speculative, but we think about who would be the people that Russians respect. I don't think it'll be, sadly, I don't think it'll be human rights activists or Washington think tankers. You know who they'll really respect? Arnie. You know, maybe a general. There's loads, so many ways in. For all the sort of Russian nationalism that Putin does a little bit of, actually, Russians are really into Western culture. Hugh Laurie, huge in Russia. Because Dr. House is the archetypal Russian hero. Kind of bitter, a bit hungover, but good guy deep down. Yeah? Dr. House, massive. So many ways to talk to the Russian people. So many channels to do this through. And we're just not doing it. And it has to be sustained. It'll get trolled. We can win. If we're going to be serious about having a sort of a way of countering Russian disinformation, it can't just be expose them, of course, disrupt them, of course, slow them down through fact-checking. We know all the things to slow them down with. You're still playing catch-up. You have to start talking to the Russian people. Actually, I think it has to go even deeper. I think we've never had a serious conversation with the Russian people about what they see as Russia's role in the world, which is what this is all really about. The Kremlin is like, we have to be an empire, and we will be an empire, and therefore we need a sphere of influence that big. And obviously we kind of go, I don't think that's possible. And that's the way the conversation ends. Are we sure the Russian people want that? Are we sure? We kind of assume that the Kremlin, did the Russian people really dream of swallowing up Belarus? Did they really dream of Crimea? Maybe Crimea they did. Did they really dream of the Donbass? Did they dream of Syria? So, I don't know. That would, of course, be very ambitious. But even before we get to there, just getting those channels open, getting that conversation going, and setting the terms of that conversation, we're just not doing it at the moment. I mean, we're just not embracing it. And I think it can be done openly, it can be done transparently. I think trying to do these kind of games that I know like State Departments and others are always tempted to do and do it through a third proxy and stuff like that. There are times when you do that because it's just what has to be done in some environments, like fighting ISIS. But with Russia, no, the Russian people want to hear from the US government. You know, there was that great moment in the 50s when it turned out that Radio Free Europe was actually CIA. Yeah? At first they pretended not to be. They pretended to be funded by a foundation for the defense of democracies. Yeah? And it was actually CIA. And it was revealed. And in Washington, huge scandal, disgrace, what were we doing? In Russia and the Eastern Bloc, numbers go up. They're like, oh, right, no, we want to know what the American government thinks. That's really important. So I would put away some of these theories that we have that they will never listen to us. Oh, no, they really want to listen to us. And the distrust is built in. That X is built in. Don't worry, they don't trust Putin either. So, you're dealing with a fairly skeptical audience. I think there's lots of it. And I think definitely the tools are there. We should do it, basically. But for that, there's a small thing. We have to know what we want. And I'm not always sure we know what we want. We know we want to slow them down sometimes, because it's like, it gets a bit hairy. But where do we want to get to them? I don't think that conversation's being had in DC and London right now. A bit distracted. But, yeah.
Okay. Next one. Kester, did you want to raise a question as well? And then the gentleman. Let's collect, let's say, 3 questions for everyone has time raised, and then you can respond.
Hi, my name's Kester. I'm a journalist. I'd like to go back to a point you raised about the 3 types of disinformation. Mm-hmm. And I don't know what you call them, the authors of this.
ABC.
C, I think I want to talk about, which you talked about should be made illegal, and some kind of sanctions applied to the originators, like you mentioned GRU, but whoever it is. How could you add a bit of meat to that? I mean, you must have thought about it.
Yeah.
How would this actually take place? I mean, and how would you do it? Yeah.
No, it's a very good question. That's the question everyone's asking. It's the right question.
Let's collect two more questions. In the back. Yeah, the gentleman over there.
Yes, Yehuda Lukács, George Mason University. Start with an anecdote also concerning U.S. diplomats. A good friend of mine, a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer, the 30 years retired. I served in Moscow several times. Last year he came to visit me in Budapest. I was here at that time. And en route he stopped in Kiev, where he ran into an old Russian senior diplomat. He told him that he's coming to Budapest to visit a friend. And this is what the Russian diplomat said to him. Remember, Budapest will always be ours. Don't forget that. And I asked my friend to what extent he thinks this was a serious comment. And he said he meant it 100%. So my question is, you talked about the Russian Empire. To what extent this type of a view that, yes, the Iron Curtain is down, but our remote control's battery is fully charged and the remote control is working very well. To what extent this view is prevalent vis-a-vis the former communist bloc?
Okay.
János Matus, my question is a little bit theoretical. An American political scientist, Robert Jervis, wrote a very interesting book about misperception in international politics. My question is, if the two risk in perceiving real world, I mean the misperception which can be explained by a number of psychological, historical and social reasons and events, and the intentional production of disinformation, which is a real danger. And those who invent disinformation are taking into account the psychological factors of the audience. Thank you.
So hold on, was the question at the end, I thought I understood it, maybe I didn't. Are you talking about the risk that policymakers start believing their own lies and make bad decisions?
The two cannot be separated. By the public and the politics.
Yeah. So do I understand the question correctly? Yeah? I don't know. I mean, yes, that is a huge risk. That's what everybody's really worried about. Certainly all my friends who do, I don't do serious work, I do posture around in media, but friends of mine who work in NATO, this is their great worry, that Putin gets so wrapped up in his own fake reality that he makes a mistake. Very interesting. All I can do is tell an anecdote about that. You talked about Hungary in '56. So apparently Prague '68. Again, I heard this anecdotally. Andropov, who I think was then in a senior he was running the Directorate for Disinformation, or was he even head of the KGB? Anyway, he knew perfectly well that the 68ers wasn't a CIA plot, but he was so keen for the rest of the Politburo to think it that he created disinformation aimed at the Politburo because he wanted to keep them paranoid. So there is disinformation flying around within the system. And yeah, I'm just not enough of an expert, but the scope for tripping over your own disinformation and ending up in a much bigger mess is huge. And look, one day we'll find out what really happened in Ukraine. My sense is they miscalculated. His information was bad. He thought Yanukovych would turn. He didn't. He didn't anticipate the Maidan. Then they had to do something bigger than the Maidan, so they did Crimea, because they already got into this. I think that probably was a case of the Kremlin just massively miscalculating on something called the Ukrainian people, who they don't think exists. So that might be the little lacking factor in their calculations. But very good question about who we're going to do it. So in terms of regulating content, or even punishing actors, no, you'd have to have a regulatory framework. You'd have to have laws, and you probably need a regulator that would focus on this. here we're getting into very complicated things with tech companies about jurisdictions and where are they based and who punishes them. That's a very, very complicated thing, and that's already coming through. I mean, like, I think Facebook will have a case against them in Austria because they had some disinformation about an Austrian politician who sued them in Austria, won in Austria, and then Facebook said, no, we're taking this to California. So yes, this is the international jurisdiction stuff is being discussed by lawyers way cleverer than me. But even if you have it at a national level, let's say at least the EU and Britain already had clear commonalities on this. So the EU directive, audiovisual directive might start getting into this stuff. So it would probably be national regulators with slightly different traditions, as you already have, by the way. So the Britain's Ofcom has a different tradition and a different regulatory principle to the German regulator, or to the one in America, certainly. My main concern is that the democracies manage to have some common principles, yeah? Just enough common principles to say this is the democratic, rules-based internet, and it's not like your internet. And that'll include things like your individual rights online, how your data is managed online, and stuff about transparency. And I think it's really important that democracies align themselves. In the Cold War, we also had different regulations in different countries, but there was still basic freedom of expression, basic media pluralism, and a basic cultural thing about accuracy and objectivity. So I think that's the critical moment. So some of the groups I've been in recently, they were all about that. They were all about, let's bring the Americans, the tech companies, the Europeans together. Just what is the, I wouldn't call it the lowest common denominator. It's like, what is just the common denominator that we can agree on? And I think transparency we can, actually. I think that's one we can agree on. Also, there's the factor of the EU being the regulation setter. So if it's EU law, then a lot of other countries will have to follow. And it's too big a market for the tech companies to ignore. The tech companies, meanwhile, sorry, just to finish up, just so you know the discussion that's going on, and it literally is happening right now. The tech companies themselves say they want to be regulated in line with international human rights law. They've said it over and over. They're like, we want international human rights law to be our terms of service. We just have to define what the hell that means in the digital space. Yeah? So even they're willing to find some international rules. I do think trying to regulate content is going to be the wrong way to go. I just see that's going to be a problem because the American tradition is so far away from the tradition of different European countries. Plus, there's the European kind of the Court of Human Rights, which is much closer to the American one. Just no one ever takes any cases there. So it's complicated. In terms of responding, though, there's two things to do. One is having regulations around behavior online and penalties for those who, serious penalties for those who break it. Another thing is, what is the proportionate response to something, to active measures? Let's say the Americans had a different kind of leadership at the moment. What would have been the proportional diplomatic response to what the Russians tried to do in America? Yeah?
In 2016.
Yeah. It's not launching a sort of missile at Yekaterinburg, is it? It's not going to be a kinetic response. So there's nothing in the information space we can really do that embarrasses the Russians because they don't care. One good proposal I heard was blocking the sale of any kind of TV digital equipment to Russia. That would really hurt them. Or maybe it should just be in the economic sanctions space. So the proportionate response to a troll farm campaign is, I don't know, a boycott of Russian larders. I don't know. Somebody else has to work out what's correct. We're very far away from that, and we need that. We need some sort of, both institutions and regulatory frameworks, and a kind of a doctrine of how to deal with what people are calling hybrid threats. We don't really know how do you respond to a cyber attack? Let's say they do take out, the Nevada election system just for the fun of it, just to show that they can. What should be the response to be there? I mean, take out a Russian electoral observer computer. They don't fucking care. So I think we actually need to think about this much more. And whose job is it? I mean, is this the military who does this? Kind of a bit too weird for them. Do you want to militarize bots? Is it the Foreign Service? Is it some sort of new interagency thing? There's going to be more and more of this, I think. And here I'm way out of my depth. Like, way out of my depth. But it just seems to me that in a kind of globalized era where everyone's dependent on everyone else, the risks to doing full-on confrontation are so high. You'll have more and more of this kind of just below military stuff. So cyber, information, you know, assassinations, the stuff the Russians are already doing, and the Chinese will probably be incentivized to do a lot of that as well. I just see more and more of that, because it won't be like the Cold War. We're all kind of intermixed, so why would you put that at risk too much? So what's going to be the doctrine of that? What's going to be the agency that deals with that? And who's going to be the kind of Clausewitz who gives us the rules of it? It's certainly not me. But I find myself in these bizarre conversations and going around different bits of government, finding myself talking to like defense. I'm like, I talk about media. Why am I sitting in one room with defense? It's kind of, we're kind of looking at each other. It's like, hello, what are you doing here? I don't know what is the thing that connects these dots. What the Russians are very good at is working in that space, because they don't have any of these problems. And they're very good at sort of coordinating these different types of behaviors. I'll stop because I'm way out of my depth now. I'm not an expert on defense or diplomacy or anything.
Thanks for your question on Jervis and the misperception in international relations. And let me refer back to a previous study we did, and the poll we did together with the British Embassy, where we practically found that in Hungary, and we assume that it will be similar in other polls in other countries, Russia's economic potential is way overperceived. So Russia seems to be way stronger economically than it really is. It seems it is perceived way stronger in terms of military expenditures than it really is, and also in terms of international influence and practically even the population is overperceived. So Russia seems to be bigger, stronger than it really is, and I think it's already a success of this image campaign, sharp power influence of Russia, that they really Russia seems to be stronger, especially in this region of the world.
So in my new book, I interview this Russian spin doctor, and he really takes us back to the 1990s. 1990s, domestically, the Kremlin's very weak. You know, there's fears, I don't know how deep they were, these fears that the country will fall apart. Definitely oligarchs are bullying government. And Putin comes in, and they have this need to restore the power, the image of the power of the Kremlin. And they realize that in today's world, you can do that through information. And so the first thing that Putin really does is take control of the TV channels. Before he takes control of oil and everything else, he realizes media is the key to everything else in a media-sized world. And like, sometimes people go, oh, the Russians, you know, we overestimate Russian power. But I think what they've worked out is actually power now is perception. So, you know, that's kind of a like, you don't need to do anything else if you can do that. And you see that over and over. Look how ISIS worked. Look how Trump worked. They realize that you can, you know, if you're perceived to be powerful, that is power. That's not an ersatz for power. That is it already. And he talks about this spin doctor. He talks about how Russia purposefully leaves its fingerprints on information operations everywhere to give the sense that it's omniscient. But because there's always a but with Russia, the military one. So I've had sort of people in DC tell me it's actually the other way around. We underperceive Russian military spending because we don't do it in rubles and as percentage of GDP, la 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 la. So we're translating it back into dollars. Why would you do that when their soldiers are cheap, when their weapons are cheap? Exactly. So actually, it's much bigger than we think. So the perception thing can pull in different directions.
Okay, last round of questions.
But again, not my field expertise.
Thanks. Just a quick clarification. You mentioned that there are 3 Putin eras so far. If you could highlight which 3 you think they are. And the other is you think that you said that Crimea was a miscalculation. How so?
No, I mean, all the events that led to taking Crimea. We don't know. I mean, we don't know. There are so many versions of how we got to that position, but whether they thought there would be a Maidan that would give them an excuse to invade, I don't know. That seems a lot of calculations. So, you know, this is the discussion of endless speculation about what happened. 3 Putin eras, I would say, and maybe there are more, but for me, in my head, there's 3. There's like first Putin era, 2001, 2008, which is the Gordy era, managed democracy, a lot of Surkov, a lot of shopping, money, wealth. Then I think you have to take the Rekirovka, this bizarre thing of a dummy president who's actually a puppet. I don't think we've seen that ever before. I think the more you think about it, the more unique it is. Kind of like the prime minister becomes the president becomes the prime minister, but the prime minister's now sort of in charge, or is he? I think that's its own thing, and it felt like its own thing. And it could have gone in different directions. And then you have, war and dictatorship, Putin. War, dictatorship, orthodox patriotism. So I think those would be the three that I would have in my head. You could probably chop it. You could do cleverer things, That's me being very kind of following elections. You could do it maybe by trials. You could do it. There seems to be when I was living there was a real change when the Hodorkovsky trial happened. The second Hodorkovsky trial. So you can do it in 3 trials. The first Hodorkovsky trial, which is Putin taming the oligarchs, and weirdly a certain amount of support, and I remember Western support as well to a certain extent. The second Hodorkovsky trial, which is already a travesty, and black has turned to white, and everything is upside down, and it's this bizarre, scary farce, and you realize, whoa, this is going in a strange direction. And then the Pussy Riot trial, which is just like, grotesque, in your face, Bulgakovian horror comedy. So you can do it in 3 trials. I don't know. It depends how you wanted to cut it up. It feels like 3. That's why I said 3. We could do a 5-act structure. Depends how many commercial breaks you want.
Okay, let's say 2 more questions. And then I think there was also one on Russian influence in the post-communist bloc that I think left unresponded. So
yes, that was a really good one. Yeah.
Okay, would you like to?
Look, I don't know the post. You meet different kinds of Russians, and especially there's a certain type of retired official who's especially like that.
He's currently still a diplomat.
Still a diplomat.
Yeah.
All I know, when I first came to Russia, so the first thing I did before I went to film school, I worked on these kind of projects. Remember TASIS? Remember the EU TASIS program? Technical assistance to the CIS, aimed at creating a single cultural space between Europe and Russia. Those are the happy days. So I just left university. I was working as a little. I spoke Russian, so I was useful working on this TASIS projects, which were usually helping regional administrations digitize their something or other. Basically involved a lot of vodka drinking with mid-level Russian bureaucrats. And that's actually a big part of Putin's support. Mid-level bureaucrats, actually. Beamtenstadt. Get drunk with them, and then it just starts coming out. And it's the empire thing just starts coming, and it was shocking. Because at some level I was like, oh, Russia's going to be a normal European country. I was 22, I wasn't really thinking in general, but... and it always started with this. Look, we can work together. It'll be Europe and Russia together against the Americans and Chinese. Think how strong we will be. And I do the usual stuff like, well, actually, Europe is not a superpower, it's a rules-based system, so you'd have to reform your course. Like, we'll do anything you want on paper. Think about what we could do together. And then a bit later, after a few more vodkas, it's like, you realise all this is ours, and all that rhetoric. Listen, if you think about the 1990s, and I wasn't in Russia in the 1990s, but look, after this very brief bit of Yeltsin apologising to the Baltic states, that rhetoric changes very fast. Yeltsin would move in his rhetoric between being quite friendly and apologising for the Soviet Union since to really sounding like an old school, Russian imperialist. Russia is already involved into conflicts in its near abroad. In Georgia, well, we forget it was very involved in the civil war in Georgia and in Transnistria. So it never stopped. It was still being an empire to the extent of its not very great abilities. I never had the sense, talking to the political culture in Russia, that even for a moment, anybody stopped thinking like an empire. And they were always very upset with Britain. Why did you guys give up? What happened to you people? Why did you give up? This is the only game in town. A real joy and a real and always thinking geostrategically. You know, it's geostrateg, you know, this geopolitica, geostrateg. They love it. That's just what they are. That's how they think. They have big maps, and they point things at them, and they carve the world up. Even when they can't control it, they do it. It's just the political culture. And I wasn't monitoring it, but not for a moment did I see it change. And it's the Academy of Sciences. You have the same thing. You come in there, and it's Kanyachok, and you start talking, and it's some guy who does geostrategia and geopolitica, and before you know it, the map is out. And you're just like, whoa, the map. It's a big map. I don't know. Like, these are anecdotal experiences, and you know, there are far more serious people than me who look at the development of Russian international relations theory and stuff like that. But in terms of the culture and the language, I don't know if they think Budapest is theirs, but they're definitely thinking big. Maybe we do as well. I don't know. Maybe there's just one. I don't know. Maybe I'm ignorant about the English system, but it was very striking there. And that, at the time it felt kind of quaint, and it doesn't really anymore. Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, Katarina said you'll speak Swedish Embassy. Thank you, I mean, for your absolute brilliant, comments and everything. I can really identify with my colleagues down here on countering the narrative. So I would very much, Google. I mean, that YouTube channel suggestion would take that into consideration in the Swedish Foreign Service. But I want to echo your own questions in the beginning, because you talked about this the kind of shift from the Orwellian 2 + 2 is 5 until planting the doubts and the seeds and everything is true and nothing is true and the doubts. Right, and you ask the questions yourself. Why is this so successful? And how come that these leaders are so successful, refuting facts, shying away from them?
Oh, right.
I want to hear your answers.
So both my books are about this, and I don't have one answer. Part of it is technical. If you're a propagandist and you have this you can't control the media. You can't censor it the way you used to. Even if you wanted to, you can't. So you have to work through, undermining things rather than trying to insist on them. So I think it's just what you do if that's the media landscape in front of you. It's much easier to undermine than to kind of assert something. But I think there's much more sort of deeper reasons than that. To do with cultural and historical shifts away from big ideologies which insisted that they had an objective truth they were delivering, and they had to break or persuade people that they were delivering them. So the Cold War was about that. It's a competition of two rational ideologies which are trying to persuade people that their version of history is right. There's a theory of history there. And in Russia is really the first place where all the ideas of all the big ideologies die. So first communism, and then by, I think, 93, for many people, the idea that democratic capitalism would lead to a happy utopia of something like Sweden, but with nuclear weapons. But also not in NATO. By 93, it was clear that wasn't happening. And it's very interesting that these kind of these pre-Trumpian politicians start appearing in Russia in 93. 93 is Zhirinovsky's first campaign. Completely different political rhetoric, which we now see everywhere, which is Duterte, which is Bolsonaro, which is all these clown-like figures really have their roots. Well, their root, they didn't come from him, but in Russia, they're like, oh wow, this works. So I think it's got to do with that. I think it's got to do with audiences' senses that facts don't get you to a happier future. That there are no big rational ideologies to cling to. And so this kind of rebellion against factual language becomes very appealing. And I think in the West, and my second book almost ends on this, with sort of a Russian spin doctor telling me that you've arrived in the West where we were in the 1990s. This idea, post 2008, post all the other obvious sort of, I wouldn't say collapse, because there was no collapse in the West like there was in Russia, but the slow disintegration of a clear common vision of the future that was meant to be great for everyone, which has disintegrated in many, many, many ways, has left us in a cultural condition which is obviously not the same as Russia in the 90s, but echoes it in many ways. So I think that's a huge part of it. I think conspiracy has replaced ideology. You know, the Soviets also did conspiracies, but those conspiracies ended somewhere. They ended with, you know, class warfare. And the Nazis had conspiracies, they ended with the Jews. But they were conspiracies which buttressed an ideology. Here you have just conspiracy as a way of explaining a very chaotic world, which again is about seeding doubt. You can't trust anything out there. So it's a mix, you know, it's this sort of how do you work, if you're a propagandist, how do you work in a world where you can't hegemonically control all the media? But also this cultural condition where I suppose people have become alienated from the benefits of where rational arguments were meant to take us. And if the facts are only telling you that your kids will be poorer than you, then why would you want to listen to the facts? But anyway, I talk about it much more fluently in my book on paper. But I don't claim that's the whole answer at all. But I think those are two ways of starting to have a discussion about it. Yeah, I don't know if that fully answered your question. I don't know if I can fully answer your question. But that's some of it.
One very last question from the back of the room. Okay, Alex.
Alex Folody, journalist. I apologise for the fact I haven't read the book yet, or the new book. I'm aware that it has a chapter about religion, extremism and propaganda. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about the place of religion in state-sponsored propaganda discourse. It's obvious where it fits in internally within Russia, but do you see uses for it internationally for the Federation and perhaps for others too?
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, let's see one more.
One more question. Yeah.
Sorry.
It's going to be the last one.
Hi. Thank you very much for your talk. I'm Gamba Toko, Central European University. I was wondering whether too much emphasis on countering the everything is possible, nothing is true narrative. I mean, all type of propaganda may make people forget about something which is more effective, and that is based on the insight that probably Russia is doing this not because it's so effective, but rather because they can't do better, that this is just a poor man's toolkit. If you think about the Cold War propaganda efforts, the one thing that surely won more support for the West in the Soviet bloc was Hollywood, which didn't cost a penny to the government. It was credible because it was not government produced, and that was certainly trying to counter that with a movie industry, just like contemporary China has a massive movie industry that produces lots of beautiful costume movies about the Tang Dynasty China for African and Asian countries where it is popular, but it seems to be that Russia doesn't have anything like that on offer, and probably that's the reason why they have to recourse to this sort of negative kind of propaganda. And if the West focuses too much on the countermeasures, then it may lose the bigger picture that it has something far more influential to work with.
So actually, the emphasis towards disinformation campaigns and active measures, I think amplifies already in the 70s and 80s, partly because of Andropov's influence, I think. He was really into it. But partly because, you're right, already then the Soviet Union had much less to sell. It was already clear that it was a bit of a horrible place to most people. So it had to go negative. So you're quite right. But are we still capable of creating cultural content that tells some greater narrative? So it could be a question about us as well. But I'm all for pouring money into cinema and TV programs because I'll benefit. And the other question was, what was the first question? Oh, religion. Okay, so you mean the Russian Orthodox Church? There's a lot more about religion in the second book. So in the first book, I don't go too deeply into the Orthodox Church, largely because the book ends in sort of 14, when the Orthodox Church was just starting its ascendancy towards power. So I think it's still before the... When was the Pussy Riot trial? Must have been somewhere around then. Yeah, but anyway, yeah, and I mentioned it. So I have a little... It appears at the end, and I have these incredible... I had an interview with these incredible Hell's Angels, you know, these Russian motorbike guys who are friends of Putin and Stalin and rock music, and the Kremlin has given them a lot of money to sort of create cultural festivals, often in Crimea, actually. Whether it works abroad, I'm just not the biggest expert. I've interviewed other people around it. There's the Orthodox Church's own political interests, which are, I think it's involved in a long-standing battle now with the other Orthodox churches, and there's a real fight on for who's going to be in charge of it. So it's between Constantinople and Russia and Bulgaria. There's a fascinating story to do if somebody can be bothered to go to Bulgaria, about how Bulgarian Orthodox Church is in the middle of this, and I think the Russians are trying to buy them off, and there's a real fight there going on. Plus there's the fight with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which has become independent and has been granted independence. So there's the political, you know, there's the politics of the church, whose followers are also outside of Russia. So in a way, definitely that's a way of expanding Russian influence. We're talking about Eastern Ukraine. Again, I wasn't there, so it's anecdotal evidence, but when I went through the territories of Eastern Ukraine that had been occupied by Russian proxy forces and then liberated again by the Ukrainian army, the people who'd been kind of getting those protests and those separatist moves ready were very politicized priests who'd been sent there around 2012, which made a lot of people think the Kremlin had been thinking about an operation in Eastern Ukraine for a long time, well, for 2 years. And so these were priests who'd come quite recently to Russian Orthodox Church churches in Eastern Ukraine, in Lugansk region. And for 2 years, they'd been preaching this kind of very, very politicized pro-Kremlin story. And they were the ones out on the street saying, we need Putin to invade. We need to be independent. Kiev has been taken over by heathens. So, you know, whether that was a strategy coordinated with the Kremlin or, again, just a case of knowing what the Kremlin wants, I don't know. So that could be a very kind of, a very direct use of the Orthodox Church in kind of, in hybrid operations. And then you have these kind of interesting kind of alliances, not always with the Orthodox Church. Some of them are with kind of like religious American groups about LGBT laws and stuff like that. And then you have some missions in Syria with the Catholic Church. I mean, there's all this kind of cross-church politics to establish various things that the Kremlin thinks conducive or strengthens its alliances. So, I think it's used very, very actively. You always hear the Orthodox Church in Russia quotes that it is, of course, the inheritor of Byzantium, the real Byzantium, and that in Byzantium, the church and the king worked as a symphony together, and so the Orthodox Church must work in symphony with Putin. So that's stated quite openly, really.
Okay, thanks a lot. It was, so we have to wrap up right now. Thanks a lot.
On Byzantium, I'm good.
Yeah.
They had to get Byzantium in there.
Thanks a lot for all of you for coming and raising these very good questions and listening, and even the ones in the back who didn't have a seat, they kept with us for the whole time. Thanks a lot for the British Embassy. Thanks, Dorka, also for raising the questions, and thanks, Peter, for coming. And hope we can. You will visit Budapest next time in the coming years, and because you can really see that there is interest about what you can tell.
Well, if you tell Hungarians about my first book, maybe they'll translate the second book.
Yeah, we hope.
I mean, yes, it's not a money thing. It's not. But it's just. I just think Hungary is so fascinating, and I love coming here. I really do.
Thank you.